Wasatch Report, shooting straight on everything from prepping to politics.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to a very special edition of the Wasatch Report. My name is Suzanne Sherman. I will be your host for the next hour. You have tuned into the Cerberus Radio Network, where we defend liberty and freedom from the flames of tyranny. I have a very special guest today. We'll get to that in a moment. Joining me in the studio right now is my producer and special friend, Jeff Johnson. He's one of the founders of the network. Jeff has a show called Paradigm Shift. We usually go back-to-back live Monday mornings. I put my show off this week to accommodate the schedule of my guest, Dan Fisher, who is running for governor of the state of Oklahoma. You can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/Cerberus Radio Network, Cerberus Radio Network. And when I'm not in Facebook jail, you can find me there too, facebook.com/Suzanne Sherman or Cowgirl Esquire. My handle, Cowgirl Esquire. You can find us there on Gab.ai as well. That seems to be a new trend in conservative social media where they are not shutting us down intentionally. We're seeing this on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and Jeff and I will be doing a show about that next week. But we also do have a YouTube channel, Cerberus Radio Network. We would request that you follow us there, subscribe, share it with your friends. Our numbers are going up. Our radio co-listeners are really increasing dramatically. I want to thank everybody for spreading the word. We do have an app. If you're going mobile, we have an app for the Android platform. We have low bandwidth options. We post on our Cerberus radio page. We also have a fan page on Facebook, and you can chime in and talk to us there. You can also hear me live on K-Talk Media on Inside the News, Tuesday mornings at 8 o'clock Mountain Time, the Paul Jensen Show. So that's really fun. We get a large audience there. We actually had Dan Fisher on a few weeks ago at that time as well. And then next week on Friday the 23rd, I will be rejoining my good friend Shiloh Platts on the Maxon and Platts Shooting You Straight with Maxon and Platts show, the afternoon drive, also on K-Talk. We're having a lot of fun over there, and it's giving us the opportunity to reach a very large audience. That's one of the benefits of terrestrial radio. One of the downsides of terrestrial radio is you just really don't get to dig in and explore the issues and have guests like Dan Fisher really get to talk about what they stand for, what they're about. You know, with on AM, you've got to cut to breaks. It's got to be short. So I'm really delighted that Dan is going to let us dedicate this hour to what he has to say, because this is literally the most important show I've done to date, and it is a matter of life and death, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that. I want to start off really quick. I'm going to spend about 1 minute on a story that just came across my newsfeed, and I'm going to tie this into my guest today, and you'll see where I'm going with this. At 10:30, this is a story from Utah County Sheriff's Office, Eagle Mountain Division, and they posted at 10:30 this morning, deputies were dispatched to a man with a rifle outside of a Maverick gas station. Rockwell Charter School was placed on lockdown for a short time due to the close proximity to Maverick. When deputies made contact with the individual, he communicated he was, quote, exercising his Second Amendment right and open carrying to promote gun awareness, end of the quote. Because Maverick is a private property and the individual was causing alarm, he was ordered to leave. So where I'm going with this is, once again, we have an example of understanding that our rights are handed down to us from the Second Amendment. We have unalienable rights going back to the Lockean theory of the proper rule of government, life, liberty, and property. When we assume that our life, liberty, property can be managed, given to us, regulated by the government, particularly this national government, we run into what I refer to as an American Holocaust because of a Supreme Court decision, much like we've had Supreme Court decisions determining what our gun rights are. We have a Supreme Court decision, it's 1973, Roe versus Wade, which has forced the issue of abortion on every sovereign state in this union. We have a man who's finally brave enough to stand up and say he is not pro-life. hold on to that thought. He's going to explain himself and why he is so different. Dan Fisher, running for governor of the state of Oklahoma. I want to welcome you to the Wasatch Report. How are you this morning?
I'm doing well, Suzanne. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm delighted to have you on my show. I listen to you with my friends on Inside the News. First, Dan, let's hear a little bit of your background. Tell people who might not have heard about you, who you are, and what made you decide to run for governor. And then we're going to get into the details of your platform, starting with abortion. We know, I say here, you have on your website, it is the primary issue, not the sole issue. I like to say it is your soul issue, S-O-U-L, not your soul, S-O-L-E issue. Tell us about yourself, my friend.
Yes, ma'am. Okay, I grew up in Western Arkansas. My wife and I both went to college, got a degree in secondary ed. We taught in public school for a number of years. My wife longer than I, because I felt called to the ministry at a young age. I preached my first sermon when I was 16. I was on staff in a very large church by the time I was 21 or 22. And then in 1984, became the senior pastor of my very first church over in southeastern Oklahoma. Was there for 8 years and then moved to Yukon, just west of Oklahoma City. Pastored a church called Trinity Baptist for 23 years. It grew to about 1,000 people, so we had a good-sized church. A couple of years ago, was part of a new church start. I'm pastoring a brand new church called Liberty Church. It's a couple of years old. We probably have 200 or so folks that are a part of it. And in 2012, because I believe that not only citizens, but certainly Christians ought to be fully engaged, I ran for the Oklahoma House of Representatives and served a couple of terms. But after 2 terms, walked away completely disgusted by the compromise that I saw in so-called conservative Republicans that certainly didn't govern that way. I also, for a number of years, have been traveling around the country doing a full-blown kind of a one-man Broadway production in period costume where I become some of the different characters, telling the story of the pastors of the War of Independence and how the church at that time was the tip of the spear, and these pastors recruited their members and people from the communities and led them off to fight for liberty. The British hated them, called them the Black Regiment. I call them the Black Robed Regiment because they wore black robes. All denominations did. And so I've been doing that for a long time, trying to awaken the church. And then early this past spring in 2017, I thought I was through with elected office. I was going to continue to be an activist, but didn't think I was going to run for office again. And people started approaching me about running for governor. And Suzanne, to be honest with you, I just laughed. It just sounded crazy to me. And it certainly wasn't an item in my bucket list. I have no political aspirations. I'm not nursing a political career. I'm not trying to take another step up the ladder in my climb to, notoriety or power or whatever. But finally enough people asked us that I told my wife, well, we at least ought to give this some thought and prayer. And we thought that we would, and the Lord would just say, no, just stay out of that. And Suzanne, it kind of went the other way. And so in June, I announced that I was running, and we've been running hard ever since. And we're headed now toward the final leg of this race. The primary will be June the 26th. And we're definitely stirring up some folks, so much so that we even got a couple of news sources that are owned by George Soros attack us last Friday. And so that's kind of where we are now. And if I need to fill in more blanks, I'll be happy to do so. But maybe that will give your listeners a little picture of who I am.
This is a great start, and I will be sharing that article. That was definitely a feather in your cap. We'll be discussing some of the issues raised in there. But I do want to touch on something you mentioned, which I didn't expect, was what you mentioned about the role of the Christians in the War of Independence. Here at this radio station, we call ourselves 18th century ideas for 21st century thinkers, because we apply the morals, the wisdom, and the values of the people from that time to modern day issues, current events, and our problems. And I say all the time, the answers are back there, which is really really explains why they try to obfuscate the truth and what these people stood for. And when you talked about also your disgust with the Republican Party or so-called conservatives. You know, after Project Veritas revealed the absolutely ghoulish behavior of the people in Planned Parenthood, joking about the babies closing their eyes and they want the meat off the bones, I was sure that was the end of Planned Parenthood. But, you know, we voted, we coped, we hoped, we got a Republican in the White House, we got both houses of Congress, and Planned Parenthood was funded again. I am so glad that you're running, because we're not going to see relief at the national level. Pardon my French. We have, and that's why I mentioned that story at the beginning of this segment, was, you know, we just assume that these rights and what our laws are going to be passed down and interpreted and applied to this entire continental landmass, 50 sovereign and independent states notwithstanding, because of the words and opinions of 9 politically appointed lawyers in their black government issued dresses. Let's talk for a moment on the issue of pro-life and why you are not pro-life.
Okay, well, I'd be happy to do so. Let me first say that I have been a proud pro-lifer since the early 80s, when the church where I was on staff in Western Arkansas worked closely with Dr. Falwell. He'd fly in and out, and we'd do all kinds of things with him. And back in those days, when the moral majority was beginning to hit its stride, we all thought that pro-life meant we wanted to end abortion quickly. And that's what we all thought. But, you know, Suzanne, as I've gotten involved heavily in politics and serving in the Oklahoma legislature, I discovered that to most politicians, when they say they're pro-life, it means absolutely nothing. Now, maybe it does to them at some personal level, often privacy, but I can tell you, when they get into government, they get into power, the last thing they seem to be interested in doing is ending abortion. They just want to regulate it like health care. And the end result, of course, is this incremental 2-victim approach that has given us 45 years of pro-lifism and over 60 million dead babies. Here in Oklahoma, over 200,000 dead babies. So I finally came to the place where, with the help of a few friends that I've acquired over the last few years, I came to understand that what I really was an abolitionist. And of course, most people think abolition is attached to slavery in the 19th century. But the idea of abolition is as valid today as it was 150 years ago. It's the whole idea of being against something and wanting to shut it down, to get rid of it. So I have completely shifted. I don't even use pro-life terminology because, frankly, Suzanne, as I said, it won't do anything. I even had pro-life Republicans, get this, pro-life Republicans, when I was in the House, kill any bills that had any chance of actually ending abortion or even coming close to ending a portion of it. They'd just kill it. And the only thing they'll pass are these little periphery bills that may sound good and make everybody feel good, but in the end, they really don't do anything. In the last 45 years, there's been over 240 pro-life laws enacted across the 50 states, and yet abortion is still legal in all 50 states. So it won't work. It's not going to work, and we keep waiting for this magical Supreme Court justice as if they had the right to foist this on us to begin with, and then we're looking to them to end it. No, the people need to stand up. And so that's why I'm an abolitionist, not a pro-lifer. Now, I am encountering a lot of people who've just never been exposed to this kind of thinking. And once they are, they shift in about an hour or less. I mean, it's amazing to see what's happening. So there is a prairie fire that has begun where people are beginning to make the shift, and they realize, like you just said with the Republicans in Washington, it's a pipe dream. Those guys are not going to do anything.
No, it really is a game changer, because the typical pro-life movement, I'll give you an example. I forgot the Republican office holder's name, but he put forth some courageous legislation that said, this is pro-life, mind you. After 20 weeks, we are going to require that you give the baby some analgesic so it doesn't feel pain. And my response to that is, okay, so given that, if I decide to end somebody's life, if I drug them and they don't feel pain, is that a mitigation to a charge of murder, which I will get? And the pure hypocrisy and inconsistency of the thought. And let's just go over the one that we hear all the time. I'm pro-life except for when it comes to rape, incest, or the life of the mother. And people just let them get away with that. Let's take a few minutes and pick that argument apart one at a time. Rape, incest, life of the mother. Go.
Okay. Well, with rape and incest, as unconscionable as those crimes are, and they are, so I don't want to sound soft on those crimes, but we want to solve that crime with a crime of higher order, which is murder. I mean, there's no way that you can answer a crime with a crime. And then on top of that, as unfortunate as it is, if there's a pregnancy that comes from rape or incest, we want to murder that baby because of the sins of their father. I mean, for Pete's sake. So it's a complete disconnect, not only in reason, but in any kind of moral understanding. Then when it comes to the argument of the life of the mother, first of all, that is a straw man, because I'm told by physicians that is basically never an issue, especially today with modern medicine. There's just not any instances where the doctor has to decide between saving the life of the mother or the life of the baby. That doesn't happen. And so it's a false paradigm. It's a straw man, as I said, to divert us, to try to make us look like we don't care. When the bottom line is, we're going against the flow because we do care. We've got a baby here that's not guilty of anything. So for someone who may have been the victim of a rape or incest, I feel for them, and we need to reach out as Christians and minister to them. But that baby should not be murdered because of it. And if that woman cannot bear the thought of raising this child, I can understand that. But there are couples who are standing in line who can't have children, some who can have and they still want to adopt, who want these babies, and give that baby up for adoption. They don't even ever have to look at that baby if that's how they feel. But to murder this child, that is the worst possible crime.
This brings up to, the hypocrisy also that we hear from the left when it comes to, for instance, deporting the families of the parents who have come here illegally. Well, we certainly don't want to punish the children for the acts of the parents. But when it comes to terminating, murdering an unborn baby because of the act of a parent, that's perfectly okay. That is absolutely an unconscionable level of hypocrisy. Also, the people that are so pro-abortion are often these social justice warriors and the leftists who proclaim that they are the champions of the marginalized, the disenfranchised, the underprivileged, the defenseless. Well, to them, I have to ask, what segment of our society is more innocent and more defenseless than an unborn baby? How do we explain that they're turning their back on them?
Well, it's because, Suzanne, I believe, and now this is me, I believe that these people have disconnected their thinking and their empathies and their emotions from spiritual understanding. The book of Romans teaches that when a culture begins to disconnect from God, eventually God will allow them to do that. But unfortunately, the consequence is they can no longer think properly. Over and over and over in that passage in Romans 1, the Bible says that God gives them up to a depraved mind. And literally that means a mind that can't think properly. So what ends up happening is there's a short circuit in their thinking. On the one hand, they have this bleeding heart for all of these downtrodden, and they think they're doing this massive amount of good. And maybe in some instances they are. I'm not going to say that they don't do anything good, but then they're unable connect the dots to an unborn child. And yet they're the same ones who will argue that if someone were to hit a pregnant woman in anger, or they're driving drunk and they run through a signal light and hit the car being driven by or a pregnant woman inside, and she has a miscarriage, then that person ought to be charged with double homicide. They'll make that argument, and yet that same woman can get in that car and drive down to the local abortionist and murder that baby, and they'll applaud that and actually want taxpayer funding to support it. I mean, that if that is not a disconnect in thinking, there isn't such a thing.
You know, when we talk about the disconnect, and I want to go back to Romans too, so don't let me forget that. But when I go to visit my parents in California, there's a shopping area. It's beautiful. There's some fancy grocery stores. There's a Starbucks, all these little eateries. And then right there on the corner with a beautiful pink banner, looks all nice and inviting, Planned Parenthood. And, you know, all I can just say, we are so indoctrinated into accepting murder. Imagine having a concentration camp where the bodies were, the smoke from the ovens and the bodies were burning right in the towns. And here we have babies being murdered. And you know what? The mom can go right and get a Starbucks. Maybe they can even bring their Starbucks in there. People are out there dining. If they could hear these babies screaming, if this wasn't so sanitized, would there be a difference? To me, it just seemed, it was just incomprehensible that we could have these babies being killed where people are shopping and having lunch, and nobody's out there. We can't, and we're not even allowed to go out there and confront people because the government won't allow us to. I mean, we just have this ingrained in our society. Go ahead.
No, Suzanne, you're hitting the nail on the head. Let's go back for just a moment. I know people cringe when some of us do this, but let's go back to 1940s Germany for just a moment, because there is the parallel. If we want to see what a culture looks like when they disconnect morality from their reason, you've got this Nazi Holocaust going on, and the communities that are close to these concentration camps are standing by, letting it happen. And a perfect example is Buchenwald. Whenever that concentration camp was finally discovered and liberated, the American military went back to the people in the community near there and started asking them questions. And of course, we don't know anything about it. We didn't know. And then they started looking through their files very quickly, and they found that many of the businessmen in those communities had been doing business with the camp itself, selling them materials. So here they were, just a few miles from what they knew was a death camp, a brutal, horrible death camp. And they're not only not doing anything about it, they're actually making profit by selling materials to the camp. Well, really, there's no difference in what we're doing today. The only difference is these murders take place in a nondescript building that looks like a dentist's office. There is no crime tape. There's no outline of a body on the floor. There's no investigation. And generally, there's no corpse because they see to it that that's destroyed. Other than that, it's the same. There's a moral equivalency here, and that is the consequence. So whenever we have these mass shootings in schools, when I went to school, Suzanne, in the fall during deer season, it was very, very common to look out in the parking lot and almost every pickup see a deer rifle in a rack through the back window. And none of us were afraid that at lunch that student was going to go out and get that Winchester or whatever it was and start firing away at us. Today, these are killing zones. Now, it's unconscionable. It's terrible. I'm not excusing it at all. But Suzanne, what should we expect when we have 3 or 4 generations now where we've taught them that life in the womb, should be the most safe place on earth, doesn't matter? Why should it surprise us then if they don't think that the lives of their fellow students matter? It's a natural extension of that kind of thought.
Well, and I've heard somebody say once the most dangerous place in the world for a black baby to be is in his mother's womb. You know, we've destroyed a generation of of African Americans. And, you know, you had mentioned also that we fail to recognize evil. Here it is amongst us, and people are having their lattes just sitting right across. You know, there was somebody that was mentioned in this article. Let me bring this up quickly. And it was, I can't find it here real quick, but it was somebody that appeared in, here it was, was it Jeff Treadwell? They mentioned this in the article, Right Wing Watch. And again, they talk about your comparison with Hitler and Nazi Germany. But they are critical because somebody had mentioned that murdering or killing an abortionist is justifiable. Now, you are not, nobody here is advocating violence. I want to get that out right now. But as I was preparing for this interview and I first heard about you, I thought, you know, because I am a firearms instructor, I teach about personal defense. And I also talk about when the use of lethal force is justified. And that is when there is an imminent and immediate fear of serious bodily injury or death to yourself or others. If you're driving down the street or walking down a neighborhood and you hear somebody screaming bloody murder in your home, you're going to act. But these babies' screams can't be heard. We know it's going on. We don't have to hear the screams. We know it's heard. We are ignoring the lawful use of force to save lives because of judicial fiat. They have declared in their wisdom, which is superior to God's in their mind, that murder is not murder. It is, going back to the Supreme Court and tying into what I said at the beginning of this show, it is decreed by the judiciary that this is a fundamental right to privacy. There is no right to privacy that was granted in the Constitution. They came up with it. Again, I tell you that we have these inalienable rights, but what they did from the 14th Amendment was come up with this fundamental right to privacy. And from that is the springboard by which they impose these on all 50 sovereign and independent states.
Yeah. No, you're right, Suzanne. Well, let's just use that right of privacy for a moment then. So let's say that these stories you hear of someone who kidnaps young girls and locks them in their home and then abuses them for years. Well, they were doing it in privacy, so don't they have a right to privacy? I mean, for Pete's sake, it's simply, it's ridiculous. And they know it, we know it. Now, as you said, I would never advocate that someone take the law into their own hands and through vigilantism go out and kill an abortionist, because we don't fix one crime by committing another crime.
And we are consistent here.
Yeah, but the government does have the responsibility to execute if necessary. And that would be the proper response to someone who is murdering humans. And I believe at the moment conception occurs, you have a human made in the image of God, and all they need is time and nourishment, and they'll be up going to school and eventually taking a job. So there's no question that we need to rescue these babies. But you're hitting a much deeper point, and that is the power that we've granted the Supreme Court, not officially, but just by our complicity. You know, when we were the first independent and sovereign states, the founders never intended to grant this kind of power to a court. And so, unfortunately, because we have, and we've just stood by, they've done the power grab, and somehow we sit by and let this happen. And this is why I'm also running not just on abolition, but on state sovereignty. If we don't stand back up and reassert the sovereignty that, as far as I can find, we never surrendered to the federal government, then they're going to continue, and they're going to do worse things than what they're doing now, unless the states begin to stand up and say, no, these powers were never delegated to you. This is an unjust ruling or an unjust decision. And as Jefferson said, it's unauthoritative, it's null, and it's void. And we're going to have to do that, or they'll keep doing this.
Yeah, and as you said before, a culture that is capable of murdering the unborn.
Oh, that's right.
Is capable of anything. Of anything. And out here, Orrin Hatch is going to be retiring, and I have said flat out I will not be voting for Mitt Romney. And people said, well, then that's fine. Then the Democrats get a seat, and we have a Supreme Court. And if we have a Supreme Court nomination, if we get one more justice, we're going to get rid of Roe. No, we're not. The answer's got to come from the states, as you've been discussing in this system of federalism.
That's exactly right.
Now, you're elected governor. Please God, I hope that happens. You're elected governor. What's the first thing you do? Let's talk about what happens.
Yeah, okay. The first thing I'm going to do upon taking office is I'm going to call a special emergency session of the Oklahoma legislature. The reason why I'm going to do that is in a regular session, the governor does not dictate the terms of the session, but in a special session, the governor gives kind of the marching orders. And so I'm going to call a special session, and I'm going to do a number of things. Number one, I'm going to instruct the legislature to put a bill on my desk that criminalizes abortion as murder. And of course, the moment they do, I'll sign it and then instruct law enforcement officials to enforce the law. There are a couple of other things right now that I'm planning on doing, which
really quick. Let me ask you really quick. Sure. Who is going to be punished? The mother, the abortionist, both?
Both.
Okay.
The mother is an accomplice of the crime. Now, here's the wonderful thing. If we can shut these abortion clinics down, then no one will have to be prosecuted because no abortions are going to be taking place.
Exactly.
I'm really, although, Suzanne, I want justice to be served, I'm not really trying to punish people. I'm trying to stop an evil here. Now, the doctors who've been committing these crimes, they should be punished. And of course, the mothers who've participated, but I'm not out to get people. I'm out to save humans. I'm out to stop murder. But if an abortion is performed, then everybody involved will be prosecuted as either murderers directly or as accomplices to the crime. There's no other way to interpret it.
And you hear the pro-life people saying, well, you're going to strap mothers down and force them to give birth on a table. As again, you're seeking to preserve life, to save lives. And I also have heard people that work with you talk about the support that mothers that have pregnancies and they don't want to keep the baby, the support that we as communities, the churches can give to these people so they don't feel like they're alone. Many of these people feel like they're trapped. They can't support this baby. Who's going to give them care? What's going to happen? We have unfortunate circumstances. But if we as a community come together and support these people, perhaps they also will be less inclined to end these lives.
Yes.
We know once this legislation is signed, before the ink is even dry on that piece of paper, there's going to be a federal restraining order issued to prevent you from putting this law into effect. What then?
Yeah. Okay. The next thing that I will do is I will instruct law officials in Oklahoma, elected and appointed, to ignore any court order, federal court order, or federal court summons. They will not have jurisdiction in this area. I mean, here's the thing, Suzanne. They don't have the jurisdiction to begin with. They took it because we let them. So we're going to have to retake our proper jurisdiction. So as governor, I will then instruct our officials to ignore the federal government's attempt to thwart the will of the people. Now, this is critical, though, and I want to really emphasize this. Obviously, if I get elected, I have run openly on this subject. So if I get elected, people are going to know this is what I'm about, and they've embraced it. But in the end, Suzanne, this cannot be accomplished by a governor alone or even by a legislature alone. This needs to be a bottom-up movement. The people in Oklahoma, in my particular instance, must stand up and they must demand that this evil end. If the people are willing to go along with it, then this will probably be a relatively short fight. Because if the people aren't with me, then they will just steamroll me. Who knows what they will do, because the governor is not the king of Oklahoma, as you know. But if the people stand up, then we can do amazing things. But I'm just going to instruct our officials, ignore the federal government. They don't have jurisdiction here.
It's an interesting hypothetical, because now this law signed into effect and these abortuariums are to be closed. What I see the federal, the national government being put into this predicament where they will be forced to, what are they going to do? Send troops out there and force the doors open on these abortuariums and say, we are here to ensure babies are going to be killed. How do they even justify such a position? Yeah, Suzanne, go ahead, Jeff.
May I interject? This is Jeff Johnson. I'm her producer, and I often interject. So what are you going to do when they send the federal marshals like they did to the clerk in Kentucky for standing up against a court? Because she was correct. She was obeying the Kentucky Constitution. Yeah. And in your case, you'll be obeying the Oklahoma Constitution. You will be within your powers as the governor, and they will be enforcing an illegal law because it's unconstitutional. They do not have the constitutional authority. So how are you going to respond when the federal marshals start showing up on the doorstep? Are your law enforcement going to be there to protect you, or are you going to submit to their tyranny? I'm just curious how.
I was so disappointed that state officials did not stand up and stand between Kim Davis and federal authorities. I really was. I thought that would have been a showdown. Do not let her go into custody. Dan, I'll let you answer the question.
Yeah, the highest legal authority in any county is the elected sheriff. So one of the things that can happen is the sheriff can simply throw the U.S. Marshals out. They do not have jurisdiction, and they do not have authority over him. The second thing that the governor can do is call out the state troopers, the state guard, which has now been nationalized, but still the governor has the right to call the guard out. I will do everything within my power to stop the federal government. Now, let me also throw something else in that a lot of people don't think about. President Trump is in the White House. And even though all of us probably wish that there were some things about him that were different, he has shown some tremendous courage, and in many instances has done some things that have pleased me. Not everything, obviously, but when he was running, one of the things that he said is that he believed abortion should be settled at the state level, not the federal level. So if I'm elected as the Republican nominee for governor in June or in a runoff in August, I'm going to immediately seek a meeting with President Trump, and I'm going to tell him that I'm the Republican nominee for governor of Oklahoma, and I'm running on an abolition ticket. I intend to stop abortions and abolish it. You said, President Trump, that that's what the states ought to do. So I want to know from you, in a state where you have an over 60% approval rating, are you going to stand with Oklahoma, or are you going to allow or even instruct your federal government to come shut us down? Because understand, there are over 60% of the citizens in Oklahoma who want to hear what you're going to do. Now, I believe that President Trump will stand with us. I really do. I just believe in my heart that he's a good enough, decent individual that he will stand with us. And I believe if he does, that will allow us to navigate this without an actual showdown in the middle of the street in Dodge City at noon. I believe that cooler, calmer minds can prevail. And I believe that once a state stands up to the federal government over this. Now, you know, the problem with California is, other than maybe people in California, they don't have the support of most of the people in the other states. Most states believe that maybe California doesn't have a responsibility to enforce federal law, but they don't think that we ought to have illegals running over our borders, which is obviously a different discussion. But in this particular instance, there is great agreement. Texas just voted. Now, this vote did not have the force of law. It was more a resolution of the people. They just voted by 68% in Texas to abolish abortion. Here in Oklahoma, we did a poll about 3 years ago, a very scientific poll, and we discovered that the Oklahomans who would be willing to abolish abortion, even if it meant standing up against the federal government, we got 63% with that kind of a serious, we'd stand against the feds to do it, a question. So in this particular instance, we're not talking about roads and bridges. We're not talking about illegal immigrants where there's a lot of debate back and forth. We're talking about the murder of the unborn that I believe, certainly at least in the center of the country here, people generally believe is immoral. So let's add this into this scenario. So you've got a governor instructing his authorities, do not bow to the federal authorities. I've already talked with President Trump, and it may not even come to that. He may do the right thing and stand with us. So there's a lot of variables here that could come into play rather than just a governor standing up against Washington, D.C.
Well, and as we alluded to at the start of the show, 13 sovereign and independent nations on a par with Britain and France and Spain came together and formed a union, and certain policy decisions, social decisions, were to remain with the states. And this is clearly one of them. Coming up with some sort of fundamental right out of thin air is absolutely an abrogation of our principle of self-governance, which was really our revolutionary legacy. So what we need to do now is you're also going to, I'm going to assume you're going to have some challenges with the state courts as well. What will you do to address those issues?
Well, what I will do is instruct our legislature to actually remove jurisdiction from deciding on life, especially life being taken by abortion, from the courts. The legislatures have that power. In fact, Congress has that power to remove jurisdiction from the U.S. Supreme Court. So I will instruct our legislature to simply remove abortion from the jurisdiction of the courts. Why should the courts be deciding whether or not we can murder babies? Murder is illegal. Murder is wrong.
This shows how disingenuous the pro-life movement is as well. They could remove this from the court jurisdiction from the very beginning, and they have chosen not to do so. If you're just tuning in, I have Dan Fisher, who is running in the primary election for the governor of Oklahoma. He is running, among other issues, I call it the sole issue, S-O-U-L, of abolishing human abortion, but it is not the sole as in only issue. We'll get to a couple of those. But I want to also let people know you can donate money and help. There is fisherforgovernor.com, and there in the upper right-hand corner of this webpage is a donate button. Please hit it and be generous. Speaking of donations, Dan, I know there are some very wealthy mega pastors. Would you like to give a shout out to some that I'm sure have been very generous in donating to your campaign? Are you laughing? I'm sorry. Do we have a bad connection?
Susan, I cannot help but laugh. Here's what's happening. I have good friends who pastor large churches. In many of them, I have preached. Now, I used to pastor a fairly large church myself. But here's the thing. Even though I've preached in their churches, I've even done the Black Robe Regiment presentation calling pastors to vigilance. They won't have me come speak now that I'm a candidate. And when I go to these churches, Suzanne, unless the pastor asks me to, I don't give a stump speech. I preach a sermon on urgency and the immorality of murdering our unborn, which every pastor ought to agree with if he's an evangelical. Did you know they won't touch me? Now, I'm being invited all over the state to speak in smaller churches, but these big church pastors are cowards. They have no spine. All they care about, and George Barna proved this in a study in 2014, all they care about is the size of the congregation and how much is in the offering plate. And that's from their own lips themselves.
I have said before that the pro-life movement cares about life as much as the NRA cares about abolishing unconstitutional firearms laws. By keeping both of these, obviously human abortion, the American Holocaust, is a much more egregious and terrifying proposition here. But again, it just goes to show the disingenuous nature of both movements, because if you have to understand, if the problem is solved, the money stops flowing, and there goes their cash cow. They cease to need to have a reason to exist. And I want to bring up Romans because I want to share a personal story. I was in a Bible study group, and we were talking about the role of government and respecting government. And of course, Romans came up, and the conversation ended, well, if you don't like what government's doing, you have to understand God allowed them to be put in place, and you have to pay your taxes and respect the government. And I said, well, what if your tax dollars are being used to murder babies? Well, God will sort that out. Keep paying your taxes. I never went back. I said, why don't you answer that?
Oh, good grief. Yeah. Well, if we're going to use that argument, then we could honestly say that God allowed Jack the Ripper to breathe, and therefore we had to just let him slice and dice however he wanted to. God allowed Charlie Manson. I mean, this God allowed business. Well, I guess God allowed Hitler. The bottom line is, yes, God has given us free moral agency. But at the same time, we have an obligation to stand for what we know is right. The Bible is filled with examples of believers not only defying the evil government of their day, but God applauding them. You could talk about the Hebrew midwives saving the babies in Egypt. You could talk about Queen Esther, Daniel, his three buddies, the asbestos boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You could see the apostles. Daniel prays when it's against the law. Jesus defies the Jewish Sabbath laws because they were immoral. There is a higher law than man's law. Now, in Romans 13, when Paul is talking about submitting to government, that is a general truth that Christians ought to abide by. But he also defines the kind of government that we should submit to. It's one that rewards the doers of good and punishes the doers of evil. But when that's reversed, Christians are supposed to submit to that. So I guess they would have believed that the abolitionists of the 1850s were wrong in trying to help slaves escape through the Underground Railroad, or Oscar Schindler and Corrie ten Boom and the like were wrong in trying to save Jews. It's just ridiculous. It's a total misunderstanding and misapplication of Scripture. And Paul also says that wives are to submit to their own husbands, and children are to submit to their parents, and churches are to submit to the spiritual leadership. Did he mean then that if those leadership individuals ask the wife or the children or the congregation to do ungodly things, that they'll have to say, oh, well, they're the authority, we're going to have to submit, God will sort it out in the end? Nobody would say that. It's a completely ridiculous, irrational, unbiblical position. And Christians, quite frankly, ought to be embarrassed that they're so biblically and historically illiterate that they would actually give a response like that.
Well, and you know what I'm also finding with regards to the embracing of the LGBTQ movement and changing what marriage means, I'm finding that a lot of the Christian churches are changing by their actions the word of God to suit the modern day political climate. And that to me says, well, like the Constitution, they think that the word of God is a living, breathing document. The Bible needs to be changed to accommodate. I have a question coming in.
Well, here's the thing.
Okay.
No, I'm just saying when we get to that place, what it really means, Suzanne, is we're afraid to submit to God's higher law of doing what is right. And so we're just capitulating, and we're trying to keep from making waves. We don't want to be controversial. That's the real problem. That's the reason people are folding like this. They don't want to create controversy. They don't want to have to deal with it.
Everybody wants to be liked. Everybody wants to be elected. And a listener is saying, ask Dan to explain how Romans 13 applies to a representative republic where the people are the final authority. It doesn't fit so nicely.
Yes.
But I think that's, if you want to expound upon it.
I should have done that. I got on my rant, and so I forgot where I was. Yeah, so when you take Romans 13 and you compare it to a representative republic, where, according to the Declaration of Independence, government derives its authority from the consent of the governed. And then Jefferson goes on to say that if a government ever stops doing its job properly, the people have the right and the responsibility to fix it or get rid of that government. So in a representative republic, The people are the authority. So when Paul in Romans 13 is talking about the authorities, well, here in the States, especially in Oklahoma, the authorities, the people, they're not down at the Capitol. They serve as servants of the people at the will of the people. So we're not breaking Romans 13. So I'm glad that that caller stepped in there and reminded me, because, you know, I get going and, you know, you forget what you have said and what you need to say, and I get all steamed up. And so I apologize for that.
Your passion's amazing. And I know, as I said earlier, this is the soul issue, not your soul issue. If you go to Dan Fisher, fisherforgovernor.com, they have a platform page. We've been discussing abolishment of human abortion. We've also discussed state sovereignty and how that fits into with this, as we say, the soul issue, SOUL issue. You also have a couple that I want to touch on before we close out, because I've read some unfortunate comments on social media on your threads before, where people are accusing you of just wanting to create a theocracy where those who might not be believers will be oppressed in the state of Oklahoma. You have some other platforms here about audit everything, the proper role of government and economy, Second Amendment, taxes, marijuana. Touch on a little bit of that so people can understand that if they do vote for you, they're not going to be under the thumb of a Christian extremist.
Oh, no, of course not. We live in a representative republic. The last thing in the world I want is a theocracy. I don't know if people have noticed, but the church has messed up the church. Why would I want those leaders then going on into the government and screwing that up as well? So they can't even lead the church right. So I certainly don't want the church in charge of the government. But Christians have every right and responsibility to take their ideas into the marketplace as much as atheists do. So what I'm saying is that Christians need to rise up, run for office, get elected, and take their moral ideas from a Judeo-Christian point of view, which is, by the way, the point of view upon which we were founded, and express those in the free marketplace of ideas. So that's what I'm saying. Now, as far as the other issues, I'm actually a Republican who believes in small government. And the way that I will do it is I will audit the government from top to bottom, and then we're going to start slicing and dicing. It is time to stop these state governments from growing and bloating like the federal government. As far as proper government, what that means is, according to the Declaration, again, our birth certificate, government's job is to protect our unalienable rights. It's not to take care of us from cradle to grave. So I'm going to get the government in Oklahoma out of the stuff it's not supposed to be involved in. We want proper government. Now, we need roads, we need bridges, we need state troopers, we need a lot of things at a state level, but there are many, many, many things that our state government is involved in that are improper for government to meddle in. And so I'm going to get us out of that stuff. And by the way, that's going to free up a ton of money to put toward the things government is supposed to do. So that's what proper government means. And then all of those other issues, I believe that we have an unalienable right to defend ourselves and to keep and bear arms. That was not primarily so we could serve in a militia. It was so we could defend ourselves. And as many people have said, if we give up that right, all the others will follow very quickly. So, you know, I'm strong on the right to defend oneself. All of those issues, I believe that education can be solved by decentralizing it and put it back in the hands of the local districts, where the parents can influence their school board and where being a school board member matters again. Right now in Oklahoma, everything is centralized either through the State Department of Education or the Federal Department of Education. Parents' opinions are irrelevant. And so they've given up because they know that they can't control anything anyway. So I'm all about decentralizing government and putting it back into the hands of the people and the consent of the governed. I can't say that enough.
Well,
Suzanne,
you know, go ahead.
Can I jump in here real quick? Yeah. Dan, I want to read a statement from a very great governor of Virginia from a bit ago. This is Patrick Henry on June 5th, 1788. You're not to inquire how your trade may be increased, nor how you are to become a great and powerful people, but how your liberties can be secured. For liberty ought to be the direct end of your government. And I think that's what you just said. You just paraphrased our great man, Patrick Henry. I'm sorry, Suzanne, go ahead.
Patrick Henry is a hero of mine. I wish we had a lot of Patrick Henrys around today. Maybe we could make more sense out of this mess. Hey, Suzanne, before we go, because I realize we're starting to kind of run out of some time.
I know, this flew past. Go ahead.
Greatly. Yeah, well, so you did something that I greatly appreciate. You know, your listeners may not live in Oklahoma, but I'm telling you, what happens in this race is going to affect them, because if Oklahoma, being small enough, you know, we only have 3.9 million citizens in Oklahoma, and 1/3 of those, 1.3 million, claim to be evangelical. So our state could turn on a dime if those evangelicals would actually stand up and do what they say they believe. If Oklahoma does, it's going to start a ripple effect across the country. And states that are like-minded are going to be positively affected by someone like me being elected as governor. So I would just like to urge your listeners, you know, we're a grassroots campaign. I don't have millionaires backing me. The tall buildings crowd hates my guts. The establishment don't like me. And of course, I don't like them much either. We need help. And so if they would go to my website and donate, they're going to be, in the long run, helping their state as well, because liberty will spread like fire if we can ever reestablish it. So thank you for doing that. And I just want to kind of put a plug in, because we need folks' help. We desperately need.
Yes, we do. It is. Here's a website right in front of me, fisherforgovernor.com. And when you get to that homepage in the upper right-hand corner, there's a red donate button. Please, we will be sharing the website again. I've been sharing this regularly, and share it with your friends, and let's get this word out. You know, we started this conversation with you on here with a discussion of somebody claiming Second Amendment rights. You know, it is very important for us to never forget we have an inalienable right to protect and defend lives. Yeah. A government, as you said, a culture that is comfortable with murdering the most defenseless members of its society is capable of anything. Look at history. Government over the past 100 years has murdered over 200 million people. And you want to surrender, not you, Dan, but you people out there, the 17-minute marchers from yesterday, you want to give exclusive control of our right to defend ourselves to these very same governments that find it acceptable to murder babies. It's absolute insanity.
Suzanne, some of my greatest earthly possessions, other than my family and my faith, are the old flintlock muskets from the War of Independence that I have, that I use in my Black Regiment presentation. I have one that was carried by Adam Miller at the Battle of Oriskany, New York in 1777. He used it to free his commander, who had been pinned to the ground with a bayonet through each thigh by the enemy, and they were going to torture him and kill him. And Adam Miller put that flintlock down, pulled those bayonets out of his commander's legs, and dragged him to safety, and then picked up that flintlock and continued to fight for liberty. He had found a place where he just drew a line in the dirt and said, I cannot go any further. And he stood and he defended that liberty. We need that same spirit today. Not that I'm calling for a war. No one wants that. But we must fight this culture war, or we're going to lose our freedoms. Our rights are going to be meaningless.
Absolutely. So, and how fitting and appropriate that such a rifle would end up in your hands. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Dan Fisher, running for the governor of the state of Oklahoma, on the SOUL, S-O-U-L platform of ending this American Holocaust, abolishing human abortion, a culture that is comfortable with murdering its most defenseless members of society is capable of anything. 200 million people plus have been murdered by government over the past century. I urge you, please go danfisher.com, go to that right donate button. Dan, I look forward to coming out and meeting you in person for your inauguration.
Oh, I'd love that. Oh, I would love that, Suzanne. Thank you so much for having me on your program.
Thank you very much. We will continue to get the word out and promote you, and you are welcome to come on back anytime and let us know how things are going. All right, everybody. Thank you. Please share this episode of the Wasatch Report on our YouTube channel, far and wide, here on the Cerberus Radio Network, defending freedom and liberty from the flames of tyranny. God bless you.